It's like, are they doing it now? Maybe.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, that was fast. Good afternoon. Thanks, Diane. Hey, women power. This is fabulous. So thank you all for coming. I am Eileen Sullivan Marks, and I, in this role, am a co-chair of the Women's Leadership Forum, along with Lourdes Oliver Marshall over here in the red and black, and we're work with a program planning committee to bring a forum to you and to NYU twice a year. We'll do another one later in the spring semester. And could I have members of the program planning committee stand and be thanked for all their work? Carol, Pat, and there are a few others who couldn't be here, but it's fabulous. And I want to also thank the founder of the Women's Leadership Forum, who's here in the front, Diane Yu, who's like, no, don't thank me. But the Women's Leadership Forum was begun, to my understanding, with the idea of exactly that, help creating forums for women in leadership and to lead and to come together and to grow. And so it's an organic organization, and I think today's panel will be that kind of conversation, as you saw by the title. And we've had a theme over, so how many people have been to former women's leadership forums? So great, so good many of you who will remember the kind of themes that came out, things like voice, things like taking risk, things like owning what it is that we do. And so this theme is about resilience and hope, but also where that comes from in our own personal stories, which I think in these days is very important to understand our own stories and feel great about our own stories. And that's really what we're going to be talking today about. Tracy Gardner is here as our moderator for the afternoon. I'm going to introduce Tracy, and then I'm going to sit down as one of the panelists and allow Tracy to introduce us. Tracy, if you don't know her, is the deputy chief. Yeah, she's known. The place runs, but with Tracy. Tracy is the deputy chief of staff in the president's office. And her responsibilities include, of course, supporting the presidential transition, facilitating progress on many university-wide initiatives, and being a liaison to many of the campus constituencies and units that you're a part of. And one of the things that brings her to this is that she came from Wagner Public Service, and she had been passed in the city of New York in the Department of Housing and Housing Preservation and Development, where she was a special advisor to the commissioner's office. And she's done a number of special initiatives in that role. And she was also chief of staff and assistant dean for external affairs in the Wagner School. Before she did that, and she partnered with the dean there. And she has earned her BA in English from Wesleyan and has an MPA from Wagner. So welcome to this podium, Tracy, and we're excited to have this afternoon conversation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people in the room and lots of friendly faces, and I think that we are going to have a great time. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. I'm not going to read their bios because I think there may have been programs or the bios, you can find them online and you'll learn more about these women as we talk. But what I wanted to do is just start by sharing each woman's title and then saying a little fact about her that you might not know from her bio and about which you'll learn a little bit more throughout the course of our conversation. So first we have, I'll go in order of how we're seated, Leena Das, who is professor of clinical law and co-director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic here at NYU. Leena has been a tireless warrior, like really a tireless warrior at the forefront of defending people who are most at risk as a result of recent federal immigration policies. And as some of you can see, she's expecting a child in February, her second child, who will join her big sister, who's almost 3 years old. So again, we'll talk more about some of this throughout the course of our conversation. Lisa Coleman is our Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, and she's also NYU's inaugural Chief Diversity Officer. Lisa grew up in a family of scientists and entrepreneurial artists, which contributed to her learning style and curiosity as a child. And Eileen Sullivan Marks, who is Dean of NYU's Rory Myers College of Nursing. She's president-elect of the American Academy of Nursing and co-chair of the Women's Leadership Forum. Eileen's family owned a 24-hour diner in Pennsylvania, and through her experience working in the family diner, she learned a lot about community service and also a lot about shift work, which served her well in her career as a nurse. So before we jump into our conversation, I want to just tell you a little bit about how we'll spend our time together. We'll talk for about an hour, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. But you each have note cards, I think, at your tables. And so along the way, if you think of a question that you want to ask, just write it down. You know, you can wave it in the air or send it up to the front, and we will try to introduce some of the questions into the conversation along the way. And then again, we will leave time at the end for some Q&A. I also want to call out the cards that you see on the table. This is advertisement, and I'm actually a walking advertisement for the NYU, the Being at NYU assessment. How many people have heard about this assessment that we're doing? Oh, good, good. I won't ask how many people have taken it because it's anonymous, but some of you volunteer, that's awesome. We really are very excited about this initiative. Lisa Coleman is chairing the working group. We have some of our ambassadors here in the room. Those of you who are ambassadors, can you wave your hands? Awesome. And we really want to make sure that we hear from everyone in the room, really. So please take some time. Maybe, you know, before we go to the reception, if you want to find a quiet corner and take it, that would work. But really, we really just want to hear from everyone. We want everyone to be heard. So that said, we will dive right into our conversation on personal stories of resilience, bringing hope to your career. So resilience is usually defined as the capacity to overcome adversity or toughness, and hope is a belief that things will work out well. And so particularly for women, it's often very important for us to be resilient and to be hopeful in our careers. And I think that now more than ever, we're at a time when we really have to draw on deep sources of strength and learn from each other. So I want to take a minute just to check who we have in the room. We have more than 100 women here, which is great, and they're administrators at various stages of our careers. So how many people here are 3 to 5 years into your careers at NYU? Do we have anyone? Show of hands. Really, raise your hands high, and I want everyone to take a look around so that we can acknowledge who is in the room. How many of us are 5 to 10 years in our careers here? How many of us are 10 years or more? All right, great. So I hope that you were able to see someone who is at a similar as well as at a different phase in your career, and that at the reception, you'll have a moment or you'll take a moment to reach out to someone and just make a connection. Each of us has a store of knowledge. Each of us could be sitting up here today, and we really want to make sure that we learn from each other. So how many of us over the course of our time here at NYU have posed a great idea that might improve a system or a program at our school or our university? Awesome. Let's actually give ourselves a round of applause for doing that, because it takes a lot to sometimes step outside of our comfort zone. And so how many of us have had someone shoot that idea down and tell us how terrible it was or why it wouldn't work or couldn't work? It's happened to me. Yeah, so we've all had those experiences of when we thought that we had a really great idea or we were trying to do something really awesome, and someone, course corrected us or shot us down, and we somehow found some source of strength to get back up and keep going and to even learn and grow from it. And we're all here today to prove that that is possible. So I want to first, as an overarching framing question, invite each of these women on our panel, who are very busy and accomplished women, to help us frame our conversation today by sharing one reason for which you agreed to be on this panel today, and why you think the issues of resilience and hope are important for women as we advance in our careers.
Great, well, I'll go ahead and
Thank you,
start.
Lena.
I was like, oh, no, I'm sitting right next to you. Well, I'm here really because Lourdes asked me to be here. And I've found over time, when you have a colleague, a woman who you deeply respect in your circle, and they ask you to be part of something, it's important to say yes. And I had a selfish reason for being here, which is that this has been a very hard year professionally in terms of the work that I do in immigrant rights. And I essentially wanted to hear from the other women on this panel and from all of you during the discussion portion about these stories of resilience, because I certainly need to hear that now, given everything that has been going on. I have certainly found, the greatest sources of resilience in my work have been the people that I represent as an immigrant rights attorney and the students that I work with, who come each year with a tremendous amount of optimism and open eyes about the way the law in my field can change things for the people that we care about, but all of that has been very tested this year, and so that's part of what I'm hoping to talk a little bit about and to learn from all of you.
I'm here because Tracy told me to be here.
The room and the time.
And of course, I wanted to be here also to delve into this conversation and talk a little bit about what resiliency and hope look like. And I would sort of piggyback on these comments that diversity and inclusion and belonging and equity work, in that work, you can see shall we say, the underbelly of institutions sometimes. I've been in charge of offices of equal opportunity, et cetera, at former institutions. And so I think one of the things that's really crucial is to really think about the hope that you see with your students and working with the people who actually contribute to the work of diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, and moving the needle. And it's really the work with people, and I say this all the time. I've stayed in higher education because of the commitment of the people in higher education to this work and to the kind of community that can be formed. And I feel very honored to be on this panel with these women because this is the kind of community that I want to be part of.
Thanks. The planning committee thought it was a good idea. But I think it's one of the other things we thought about is, so my story is in the health world, and having recently been elected president of a major national nursing organization, it's like, oh, how did you get there? What's that story about? And I think, and in the time of, the adversity of immigration, equity, health right now is very much a part of our conversations. But to me, also, I wanted to be able to tell the story is that it's not that you are preordained to be in a leadership position. It's the steps you take along the way. And that when I have students who say to me, oh, I could never do what you do, and it's like, well, I did what you're doing right now, and it's just one step in front of the other. And as the older woman in the group, as I could say, more than 10 years of work plus, that telling that story is that it's a journey, and so I'm happy to share some of that. And it's not, as I said, some wonderful vision that descends upon you and you are now the great leader. Okay. It's just doing the work and one foot in front of the other.
Mm-hmm. So picking up on that kind of journey throughout the course of one's career, Can you, and I'll pose this question to all of you, can you each share with us a specific example of a time in your career, and it might be when you were more junior or when you were more senior in your roles, when you faced a really tough challenge? And can you just explain to us what that situation of adversity was like and how you overcame it and what lessons you learned from it?
When I was much younger, I worked for a corporation. The corporation shall remain nameless. And I had been hired to work at that corporation it was here in New York, and I had been hired to do work in the diversity, inclusion, and belonging, what we call now in equity. And it was really to look at, I worked for the foundation, philanthropic part of this particular organization. And I was to review grants, and so how we were giving money away, which I thought was the greatest job ever. To see why people gave money away. And so I started to notice certain patterns in terms of the ways in which we were giving money away. And that was what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to identify those patterns and then tell people about those patterns. Well, then I did. I identified the patterns and then I told people about the patterns. And things didn't go well. Because I isolated patterns. One of the patterns, for instance, was that the president and vice president went to the same school. And we happened to be giving that school every year $500,000 to $600,000. But we were giving women's organizations $2,000. So I started to notice patterns about sort of who was in the leadership and then how we were giving money away. And I thought perhaps we could break that up a little. And so then, as a result of multiple conversations, I actually met with, at the time, there's a woman who was one of the vice presidents of this corporation. And she and I actually came up with a plan to figure out how we could, is manipulate the right word? Change. The opportunity presented itself to change, actually, the ways in which the grant applications came into the system. So that way we were able to then modify then how we were giving funds away and actually increase the dollars for those who were part of underrepresented organizations.
And can you tell us a little bit about how people reacted to that proposed change?
Yes. Well, initially the reaction, as I started alluding to, initially the meetings weren't going well. I would say that people were asking me why I identified these patterns, and I kept referring to my title and my job description. And so that was one of the things that we had to sort of work through. But I think over time, I think this is key to any journey, as sort of I was talking about earlier, is how do you build relationships? So first, how do you identify the issues, what the issues are? So I was identifying one issue, which was the grant issue. But the issue actually was that we had a tradition and a culture and a practice, right, that was part of the infrastructure that needed to be identified. And then I needed to identify who the community members were who were part of that, who could help me to think about repurposing and reprocessing. And that had to be some people who were part of the original formation, and then new members, right? So when we talk about innovation and entrepreneurship, how do we bring, right, tradition and innovation and entrepreneurship together? And to change an infrastructure or an institution or practice, you have to bring both of those things together, because you have to look at the traditions and the practices, and you have to look at what you want to do next, and how are those things going to work together? And that's part of the journey that you have to go on together to figure out what the next steps are going to look like. So in the end, right, the very vice president who initially said to me, well, we are comfortable with our practices and our traditions, and we would like to uphold those. By the end of our conversations, he was saying things like, well, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to grow. And I said, yes, indeed. Indeed it is. Indeed it is. And from that, we did. We were able to grow. And like I said, we were able to grow the giving patterns quite dramatically over the course of that 3 years that I was there.
Awesome.
Great. I was, there's several stories that I thought of when Tracy posed this question, but I think I'll talk about my earliest experience of facing up to adversity. And I go back to high school, which is a time when we're all growing and, what do we know and what don't we know? And I was a good student. I went to a medium-sized Catholic high school that was co-ed in the Philadelphia suburban area. And I was active in a lot of things, and one of them was the newspaper. And I loved working for the high school newspaper. And so there's two stories with this. In my sophomore year, I wanted to write on the editorial page. And we had a nun who was in charge of the editorial page. I remember it was a co-ed school, because usually the schools were divided. You either went to an all-girls school or an all-boys school, but because our region was a little smaller, it was combined. But there was this, a nun in charge, wonderful nun, in charge of the Sister Felicia of the newspaper. And traditionally, the boys always got the editorial page. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going into junior year, I guess, and a boy got the editorial page editor. And I was told I could write on that page, and met with him and the nun, and he was telling me that I should write like this is 1968, like the girl's point of view, like girly stuff. Now, I was also captain of the basketball team. I was, I didn't look particularly feminine. I was this tall. I weighed about 125 pounds. I was still growing. I was almost still prepubescent. So I'm like not your curly-haired, makeup-y kind of. And I'm like, really? I'm going to write, a satire column is what I'm going to do. And he says, we're going to call it Bits and Pieces. And I'm like, bits and pieces, okay. And I said, fine. And I started to write these sort of satiric inside classroom stories, not gossip, but did you know that so-and-so, was seen in this kind of a place at this time, blah, 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 blah. And it had an academic ring to it, but it was kind of like, oh, did you see the change in the locker rooms related to this or that, or this or that? So I was kind of like this snoopy reporter sort of reporting these things, and it got very popular in that year. And it's kind of like, oh, at first they were like, no, this isn't a good idea. You're going to write about this or that. I don't know, recipes in the kitchen, because my family ran a restaurant. I mean, I could probably, but anyway. So it got very popular, and so then it's like, oh, what a good idea. This is really putting a new face on the newspaper. But then in terms of adversity, the next year, that particular nun who was running the newspaper got transferred. Another nun came in, and she didn't know any of the plans, but the plan was I was going to be editor of the editorial page from the other nun. And so when the new teacher came in to run it, she was very much about having the girls run all the pages, but she gave it to a different girl than me, a different woman. It was really girls. And it was someone I knew well and I liked, but she hadn't written on the editorial page. And I was like, I was stunned. I was so horribly disappointed. And because I was like, well, this was going to be my thing. Well, I was going to do the editorial page, And my best friend, and then I didn't want to complain because this other childhood friend who was now doing it is another woman-on-woman thing. I didn't want to complain. And a friend came up to me and knew and said, we're going to go talk to Sister. And I'm like, I don't know what to say. I'm so upset. And she says, I'll go with you. And she did. She said, she knocked on the door, she said, I'll go with you, we'll go talk to her. And she stood there next to me while I explained this emotional story of my expectation that I was going to be the editor, and now I wasn't, and I'm upset about that. And she said, oh, the nun, well, we'll make you a co-editor. Like, that should have been a proposal I could have come up with. So that was a lesson in one, you put yourself out there. Don't let yourself be overwhelmed by your emotions or your disappointment that you didn't get there. Put a plan together, get some support, propose something, and put it forward. But I wasn't capable of doing that at the time. I was just upset. And But that was a lesson I took with me. Oh, get support, talk to other people, get a plan, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, everyone was happy. And in some ways, everyone said, oh, that's a much better idea, because people were like, okay. And we had the boy, Tom McDonough. We had him do the sports page.
That's awesome.
Which he was happy to do. Yeah. But that, goes back to the story of resilience and hope. And, I remember things like that.
Thank you.
Moving ahead.
Alina?
That's so true. So I guess the period that comes to mind most in how this question is framed is probably when I first started teaching here at NYU. I never thought when I was in law school that I would become a professor. It just wasn't. It wasn't a career that I just assumed that I could have. It wasn't something that I could picture myself in, and surely in part because there weren't many people who looked like me who were my professors. And I went to law school to be an immigrant rights advocate, and so that's what I did after graduation. But then a teaching fellowship opened up to co-teach the Immigrant Rights Clinic, which I was a student of, and it was to teach with one of the professors that I had as a law student, and I had loved my experience as a student in this clinic. And to me, I thought, oh, this is wonderful. It'll basically be like I'm back in law school, working with these really dynamic people, working with a woman who I greatly admired, and it would be a great job. And I thought, it would last a couple of years as a fellowship, and then I could decide what to do from there. So when I got into the job, I found it to be everything that I wanted it to be, but then suddenly I realized, well, I'm now in this role of co-teaching, and the woman that I was co-teaching with was incredibly supportive, very thoughtful, recognized that, given our age difference, experience difference, she was a much older woman, a white woman. She had been teaching as a professor at the university for a long time. And she was very cognizant of the fact that I would be coming in and we'd have to manage dynamics with the students. And so, I started in that role teaching, not having had any training in terms of what teaching was going to be. So I would have to self-learn and observe and to read and to think about it. That I really then got that full sense of what happens, I think, over the course of many stages of my career, of this kind of imposter syndrome, being like, oh, can I really fit in that role of a professor? Can I, here I am, I'm a teaching fellow, there's dynamics already just about the job, but we really designed it to be a co-teaching role. So how can I come in here and fill that role? And I think because of the concerns that I had, and a lot of the concerns I had, some of the students were not much younger than me, one or two were older, as a young woman of color who looks like a young woman of color, I was very concerned about this, that my instinct at the time was to kind of create a formal distance between myself and the students, to try and really act the part that I thought was required to be a little bit more like my co-teacher and how she interacted, to kind of play the role of what I thought a professor looked like and acted like and talked to the students and that kind of thing. And I found it to be quite a struggle. On top of just learning to be in that role generally would be a struggle for anyone. I was trying to do it in a way that wasn't necessarily true to who I was. And, it was interesting because a lot of it has to do with a lot of the gender dynamics that, we experience every day, where I started to think over time as I was teaching, feeling like I was really struggling to get it right, to make it feel natural, that I thought, well, this kind of formality, this distance, this feeling of like, the professorial role wasn't really me. And when I thought about my own supervisors, the ones that I really learned the most from, they were in what I would use, what I benefited most from was a very nurturing role. It was something that was very warm, very kind, very personal, in a way that wasn't necessarily the formal professorial type that we often see in many educational institutions. So I really thought a lot about that. And it was actually only a couple of years in when my colleague, who is also a very warm and nurturing person, but kind of seemed to be able to do that more easily because she already had the stature of being in the institution for so long. She went on leave and I was teaching on my own. And I found it there when I was really kind of given the role of being the person that students came in to associate and being like, oh, that's the professor for the course, and that I, brought in someone to co-teach with me, that suddenly I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna be me. And, some of the distance or formality I'm gonna let go of and just be the kind of person that, I appreciated as a supervisor, even if it does kind of emphasize some of the images that I worried would somehow undercut my role as a professor. I'm just gonna embrace it. And I found, for me, that's really where I kind of settled into the role. And I thought, you know what, I love doing this, and I love doing it the way that maybe other colleagues don't necessarily adopt in their own model, but it's comfortable to me. And it's something I reflect on a lot because I realized a lot of my choices about how to approach the role when I first started were very externally imposed. It wasn't, no one told me this, but I mean, it was just the feeling, the viewpoint, combined with my own maybe insecurity about, is this, do I deserve to be in this position? Do I have the experience? Do I have the credentials? Do I look the part? That certainly influenced me to make choices that ultimately put me at odds with myself and didn't necessarily result in a more comfortable experience. And so once I really let go of some of that, it was incredibly rewarding to just be able to take on the role. And often it's something that I talk about with my colleagues now, where sometimes we'll have discussions about issues, whether it's diversity issues at the law school or positions that we might take with respect to requests that students make, demands that students make about our institution, where I tend to side with the students. And and often I say it's because I've, instead of trying to create the distance, embracing the fact that, frankly, I look and have experienced life in a way that's much closer to my students' experience than I will ever to my colleagues, just because of our hiring, that most of our colleagues have been professors at this institution for many more years and are a different demographic than I am. And so it doesn't mean that I need to be more like my colleagues. It means I should embrace the fact that I am very much like my students. And I think that has given me a much more pleasurable work experience. And it's allowed me to feel much more comfortable in my own skin and to relate to a lot of people in the classroom who often raise these same concerns as they walk into a law school environment that tends to be very male, very white, and not necessarily reflect the diversity of experiences that we all have.
Eileen, did you want to piggyback?
I think that's a good point. It brought to mind just a quick point to make. When I started as an associate dean in my prior institution at Penn, I was associate dean for practice and community affairs. And I remember thinking, now I have to behave in a certain way. I'm now an associate dean. I had been a professor and teacher and all of that, but I remember doing things like, I have to get up very early in the morning, and I have to work all day, and I have to, posture a certain way of being, and quickly it didn't feel right. And so I think being in touch with myself, one is not that I don't get up early in the morning, but that you don't have to work all day. One of the rules I made for myself when I was in a doctoral program with 2 children under 2 was that I don't do any work after 8 p.m. at night. And I still adhere to that. I don't work after 8 p.m. at night. I might do some work early in the morning, but that's what works for me, because if I work that late at night, I'm less productive. So that then, fast forward to when I came here to NYU as dean 5 years later, I didn't do that. I just was myself, because I learned through that last position that being yourself is the most power. You're getting that power and you're putting it forward and you're just myself. So when I stepped into this role, everyone said, boy, it's just smooth and easy, because I just stayed within myself and was who I was.
I just want to piggyback about when I remember when I first started teaching as well, and those perceptions really did influence that external, and also being a woman of color, looking younger, sort of what you touched upon, was really crucial when I first started teaching, because people questioned my credentials quite often, actually, when I went into the classroom, depending on the university or structure. And so then navigating that as well, and navigating my authentic self, and then these questions that would appear because I was a woman, because I was a woman of color, et cetera. So that navigating that was also very interesting. But finding, I think, support from colleagues, et cetera, was crucial. Because some of the people, I did a lot of team teaching early in my career. I taught with political scientists, I taught with mathematicians, et cetera, which is some of what Tracy talked about earlier. I've always been interested in this combination between the arts and science, and so I did that a lot in my teaching as well. But it also often paired me with people who were very different than myself. So I think that's really crucial to think about how you navigate your journey, what supports you put in place, and then how you think about that in terms of mentoring others as you, particularly as a professor or in the classroom.
So to build upon that, and we had a call maybe a week and a half ago to talk about what we wanted to convey during this session, and some of the points that came out related to providing those of us who are more advanced in our career or further along in our careers, recognizing when other women are being perceived a certain way or being treated a certain way. Can you share, I think Eileen, you had a particular story of how you handle that in meetings, and then I'll ask Alina and Lisa as well if you'd like to share thoughts about that.
I've developed a skill some time ago when I was representing the American Nurses Association to the American Medical Association's payment system. You can imagine those dynamics. And so that was a great experience, 11 years working with that group, that it's okay to interrupt. And I learned the skill of interrupting as it's used in those kinds of patriarchal or hierarchical, or, this is just how you do it. You learn to interrupt, and without being offensive, I guess. And so now when I see that dynamic being played out, I use my skills as an older woman in a group to interrupt the men to bring the younger woman into the conversation, because it happens all the time. I'll be at a dinner, a gala here in New York, a board that I'm on. And so with some new people at the table, there was a younger woman than myself who was at the table, who has a very dynamic job in the city. And she was here, there was another gentleman here, myself, another gentleman here. And so the gents just kept talking. And there was, other people were engaged in a conversation, and it was a round table. And she was just left out because they had to talk through my face, and so I was right there. And I just interrupted and said, I think it was Sonia was her name, gee, what do you think? Or you haven't said anything. And they're kind of like, oh, yes. And they suddenly switched the conversation to there. So I think that's very important to understand how to do that. And when I see it in cocktail receptions, when I see it in these other informal things, I will always just interrupt and bring, and then I've just been doing that.
How many of you here have developed that skill of being able to interrupt when you see that someone is being talked over or someone is not being given an opportunity to raise a point? Can you raise your hands up high? Yeah? Okay. And how many of us feel uncomfortable with interrupting or finding our voices or making ourselves heard? Okay, so those of us who feel uncomfortable about it, please, can those of you who feel comfortable about it raise your hands again? please, at the reception, find a woman who has her hand raised now and ask her for some tips about how you might interrupt, either for someone else or for yourself, so that your voice can be heard as well. Lisa, did you have something that you
I
wanted?
mean, I agree with everything that Eileen said. And I think as an introvert, I know this is one of the questions. As an introvert, I think for me, the learning to interrupt and then learning to figure out what that meant. And I'm going to go back to high school because I went to a single-sex high school as well. And then I went to a co-ed college. And that was quite interesting because when I got to college, all of the people who were in leadership positions, who dominated conversation, et cetera, were men. And I started asking questions about why. And I was labeled certain things because of those questions. Those questions weren't very assertive at the time. I was to become more assertive over time. Initially, they were just questions. But as I was going through that process, I remember very much the questions coming back to me and me being labeled aggressive or a feminist, or which feminist was a bad word back then. I mean, maybe it is now, I don't know. But being labeled certain things. And then figuring out how to interrupt, right? And so after I was president of both the Geek and the Nerd Girl societies, I realized that it's actually very important with women, particularly in fields where they're underrepresented, and often women who, because of communication styles, and for women who are introverts and shy like myself, to provide space, as Eileen mentioned. So one is through interruption, but the other is, and a friend of mine taught me this in group dynamics, particularly as a leader. I will go and sit next to or be with the shyest person in the room because I'm the leader. And so if I'm sitting next to this person, then I will often bring them into the conversation, right? And if you think about group dynamics, right, calling on the introvert or the shyest person in the room sometimes will traumatize them. That's not, it's not business school, right? It's the cold call, right? So I went to business school for a little bit too. So that's a very different methodology, right? And so not everyone's comfortable with that. So I think we have to figure out how in group dynamics we interrupt in different ways depending on, and I saw how many people raised their hand who were not comfortable with interruption. So how do we think about interruption in the more assertive way, and how do we think about other forms of interruption for those of us who, I'm good with this one now too, but for earlier in my life, I wasn't as good. So I had to have support systems and literally groups of women walking in together. If you think about what happened with the Obama administration, and some of you may have read this in the Times, where the group of women banded together and then would just start talking and bringing up issues because what had been happening is the men were taking over the conversation. So they did it as a group so they wouldn't be individually isolated. Does that make sense? And that's the kind of support system that was I think can be very helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that's what I've relied upon also as an introvert is the support system. Again, it's very easy for me to relate to my students who feel this way because I went through law school, at least my first year or two, very rarely raising my hand to participate, certainly not the image of the popular TV image of a lawyer, banging his fists on a table and raising his voice belligerently in a courtroom. That wasn't me. And so, the interruption and cold calling, which we do in law school in some classrooms as well, was something that was very difficult. And it took me a while to appreciate that. And this is something that I think is very important in terms of mentoring those who are coming up through this same system, at least in the legal profession, that it's not necessarily, like you don't have to adopt the model that you're necessarily totally uncomfortable with. You should push yourself, but really think about what it is that makes you uncomfortable about it. So I found for me, I'm the type of person who just needs to think everything through before I open my mouth on an issue. And that's a problem in a classroom when they, pose a question you haven't thought about. And obviously there are people who will raise their hand and they will speak and think out loud my strong suit. And over time, you know, as I developed expertise in immigration law, I don't have that problem anymore because I've already done the preparation. I know what my views are, my opinions are. So if I walk into a room, I don't have to worry as much about that. But it also makes me know that if I'm going to walk into a room that isn't about immigrant rights issues, I have to do my homework and get myself to a point where I feel comfortable because I know that that's the particular barrier that I have. And I think it's important to recognize people that can be an asset. People, it's not necessarily the person who's engaging in this conversation who's going to have the knowledge in the room. They're just the one who's comfortable talking on their feet. And that's a great skill to have in a lot of settings, but it's also a great skill to have folks who really want to be prepared and thoughtful about what they say. And so, you know, we try to encourage people to really kind of self-assess how they interact in these kind of dynamics, and recognize whether it is a problem. It's easy to silence yourself in a way that's very unhelpful, and try and overcome that if that's the challenge. But if it is a question about just a different technique in getting that comfort zone, whether it's preparation or something else, then really encouraging that technique. And I do think it's incredibly important. I think for the times where I recognized that it wasn't really just about preparation, but almost a fear of hearing your own voice in a room, especially if, you know, the first moment you speak or, you know, the first time you're really kind of introducing your views to a group. For me, what I often like to think about is like the easiest way for me to do that is when it's not about me. You know, like if it's about my clients, I have no problem going into a room and telling someone what they should do or what I think or my opinions because it's not about me. When there's no longer this other person to advocate for, and really you're just advocating for yourself and your own views, suddenly I feel shy and don't want to, you know, like I want to be careful about what I say and think it all through. And so I just realized there's a lot of settings where you have to be your own advocate, and really put yourself in that role and say, you know what, it's whatever kind of views and that you may have kind of grown up in yourself believing and thinking through, and that might be holding you back from expressing yourself, you know, pretend you're advocating for your client or your friend or your colleague and not yourself, and suddenly it becomes a little bit easier. Mm-hmm. So for me, I found that works, and that's often the conversation I have with other people who kind of come from a more introverted viewpoint, and particularly in the legal setting, feel like they're somehow at odds with, again, that external view of what how they're supposed to act or how they're supposed to converse in a big setting.
And we talked a bit about finding opportunities to practice those types of skills and stepping outside of our comfort zone. And we began to wonder the extent to which NYU provides these opportunities for women. We often get it from our friends or from our supervisor if we happen to have a supervisor who nurtures and develops us. But we wanted to actually ask those of you who are here in the audience today if, I guess we could just do it by a quick show of hands, have you found opportunities to develop those types of skills here at NYU? Sort of, kind of? Yeah, would anyone like to, who had a good, positive experience of that here at NYU, would anybody like to share a little bit about what that experience was like, whether it was a supervisor or a resource or something?
Yeah, I mean...
Okay. Can you turn on your mic?
Oh, sure. Is this it? You know, I mean, I came here very young to get my tuition remission and get some degrees. And I can sincerely say it was stronger, older women than me who believed in me, who saw things that I could do that I thought were fiction, and talked me into it, literally, in ways that still make me anxious today to think about it. But I remember the day I was asked to be dean, I cried. And I said, just like these women here, I said, I can't do it, that's not me. I can't dress the part, I can't talk the part. And I literally had an anxiety attack and cried. And it was, I think, and I realize it's the gentleness with which people explain something to you, and I think I've always had that as a child. Like, if you just take the time to explain it to me, just don't go, oh, you'll be fine. Oh, you can do it. But to me, the key element was not the deep, passionate belief in a skill I didn't think I had, but someone who took the time gently explained to me why. And so that I could see myself in it, I could picture it, I could envision it. Not, some ways that we encourage each other as women are dismissive, I find. Oh, you'll be fine. Oh, you do that all the time. No, actually, I'm not fine. Each time it's new, but the gentleness of explaining it to me, Allison did that with this job I just took. And I find that always gets me over the hump of I can't, I don't want to.
Thank you for sharing that personal experience of individual women who have helped you advance your career along the way. Does anyone else have an example of maybe something that was institutional here at NYU, a resource that you were able to draw upon that wasn't related to a specific person or a relationship that you had with someone?
One of the things that we do in healthcare is that we do have mentorship fellowships that are external to NYU, and so in some ways NYU is supporting them. So this is the dean talking. So we facilitate developing exposures to training and fellowship within the health professions, and I think we try and make sure either through individual mentorship of faculty to their mentees, or, as an administrator, okay, these opportunities are up. How many people have we sent to these leadership training opportunities? Because those formal ones are very good and in some ways take you out of your job. So, speaking of introvert and extrovert and all of that, I had an opportunity in '93 to do it was Health and Human Services sponsored, but it was a year-long fellowship leadership training program in healthcare, where not only did you get some mentorship, but you got training. We got media training, we got training in interruption, we got assessed as to, well, if you're more introvert, extrovert, I'm the extrovert, which we get our energy from people, and we talk and think as we think as we talk as we think. But then I had to learn that that's not going to be helpful in a team all the time. So you have to listen, and also it's what we do as nurses is listen, so you had that skill. But I think those kind of opportunities, and so in some ways, how could NYU support that might be, do we also send people out? Because going out, for me, outside of my work every day was really, really helpful to be exposed to other people from around the country, around the world.
I've been part of some of those the HERS initiative, for instance. I was part of that, and I think that was really good. But I also wanted to say that I went to school here. I did my doctorate here. And actually, Philip Bryan Harper, who is now the dean of the graduate school, was one of my professors. And I remember Phil for the course for the students, right? So he was the professor, but it was structural. And one of the things that we had to do was do a conference presentation. And we had to do it like it was a conference presentation. It was 10 minutes. You couldn't talk longer than 10 minutes. I mean, actually, Phil was very rude. He was very rude about the entire process. When I think back on it, I'll talk to him later about that.
Tell him that you said that.
But it was a training ground on how to have your voice, say what you needed to say in the amount of time that was allotted, and do it well. And I thought back on that moment over the course of my career many, many times, and I have a number of friends and colleagues who are now in positions, Alondra Nelson, head of the Social Science Research Council, who went to NYU, et cetera. And we all were in this class where we had to learn this skill. And when you think about resource and structure, it was in the class, it was structural, and so it was something that we actually, a skill that we took away. And that wasn't about reading, we all had to read the books and do all of that, but I'm saying something that we could utilize for our careers for the rest of our lives. And it's not lost on me that so many of the people who were in that course have done so well.
Nice. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to shift gears a bit and ask you to talk about how you find opportunities to rejuvenate yourselves. We often work all the time and we're all super motivated and driven and highly, accomplished, getting things done. And in order for us to be resilient and to have space to be hopeful about our careers, we have to take care of ourselves. So I'll ask you each to share a little bit about how you make the time, not find the time, but make the time to rejuvenate yourselves.
Well, I can start because my answer will be short. This is why I wanted to hear what everyone else had to say. Yeah, I'm struggling with that still. I realized when I became a mom that the way that I was so able to take on so much with work was because I worked all the time. And then suddenly, because I was just thinking back to your comment that you don't work after 8 and how wonderful and important that is. My old style was to just work all the time. If a new issue came up, if something happened to one of my clients, drop everything, just stay late. And I love work, so it didn't feel like a deprivation. But slowly that made me lose all my hobbies and anything else I was doing. And again, because I love work, so it didn't feel weird. And then when I had my daughter, obviously you can't do that anymore. So she really is, right now, to be perfectly honest, my main non-work, and my husband, of course, is like, what about my main non-work life activity, and she rejuvenates me and she allows me to experience the world in a new way and to think about things that have nothing to do with, frankly, what is right now a very kind of depressing area to be working in, which is so wonderful. But it's not what you're talking about, because it's also really tiring and hard to be a mom. So yeah, that is my non-answer to your question, because I hope you two will explain what you do to rejuvenate.
Well, I'll start by saying I still struggle, and I just got here 2 months ago, so I'm quite busy right now. But first I will say I love film and I love movies. And initially, because that was one of my subfields here, it kind of bridged on work. So I've had to figure out, going to a movie with me sometimes for my friends wasn't very fun. So I had to stop critiquing the movie and actually just, watch and enjoy it. Like, Jurassic Park doesn't need my full commentary from the beginning to end. But the other things that I really enjoy doing, I really enjoy cooking. And I find it very relaxing. And for me, I like doing things, I used to do things that were related to my work. And that was how I was trying to decompress. And I found out that didn't really work in some ways. I used to spend a lot of time with my former students. I still do that. But it's still in that mentoring relationship, those kinds of things. And so I had to find arenas where I could express myself differently than in my sort of formal trainings. And so for me, cooking is one of those places where I'm able to just sort of experiment. I'm not a baker, I cook. I want to make that distinction, right? Because I say that because baking is science, right? And I don't want to do science when I cook. I actually want to experiment. And I love to garden. I live now at 4 Washington Square Village, so for those of you there who know how to garden on terraces, I'm looking for help. So I'm going to do some of that. And then the last thing that I picked up, and a friend of mine, 3 of my friends gave this to me as a birthday present a few years ago, and because they said I needed to get out of my house and get out of my life in certain ways, and they gave me a flying lesson. And there was an airport close to where I used to live, and so I took the lesson, and as it turns out, it's really fun. And you can learn a lot, and it's totally different than anything I've ever done. So I've now moved to New York, and I'm going to look for a place to follow up on that, but I've already taken 6 lessons, and I'm very interested in this idea of flying. I've always been interested in flying. I've done parachuting and those kinds of things, but I'm interested in that idea, and it's totally different. And being in the air, being sort of away, and just reflecting just seems like a wonderful thing. And then I can come home and cook. So,
Nice. Eileen, I'll pose the question to you slightly differently. As a dean in charge of a large unit, how do you ensure that people on your team are able to or encouraged to find the time to rejuvenate.
And they're here in the room. So, yeah, that's very hard because when you're in the cyclical cycle of an academic year, there are certain times when things need to be done. But I think as a nurse, you're always sensitive to assessing and picking up, and we educate, we work ourselves into that. We can pick up perceptions of people. So I think I hopefully try and remember those skills, that I can see things in people and say what's happening with you or what's happening with that, or sort of understanding that when this must be an issue for this person, so let's make sure that that person is okay, or check that out. So I think I do that. The other thing that I do with the team is I talk about what I do to chill. And I think that gives people permission then to do it. I worked for a dean in a prior job who was one of these short sleepers, high energy, charismatic, fabulous, accomplished person, but she slept 3 hours a night. And if you tried to imitate that, you would collapse. You just can't do it. Nobody did, and she said, don't do this, but this is what I do. But she gave us all permission not to be that. So I think I try and give people permission that it's okay to leave at a reasonable hour. I don't try and impose rules around time, and I tell people I don't work after 8 o'clock. So I think there's movements now where it's important not to send emails on Sundays. It's important not to send emails at night. Like, you may want to get it off of your chest and get it out in email, but that sends a shockwave to your folks who are doing your work. Like, I have to respond to that. And I don't think I do that too often, or if I do, like, don't pay attention to this, I'm just sending it because I don't want to forget to do it. So I try and stay sensitive and try and do feedback from time to time. Maybe we need to do a little bit more of that, like, how is it going? But this is the tight time of the year. And hopefully we can celebrate. But last week, the week before last, right before Thanksgiving, that week when it's like tense, I came into work, Sam, what did I wear? I came into work wearing a lovely hat. And it's a hat that I bought, and it was lovely. And I walked around in the hat all day. And everyone loved it. I mean, people responded, took my picture, we put it in the weekly newsletters. It was just a nice hat that went with the outfit. But it was like, hey, it's okay to be lighthearted and happy today. And so I try and do that from time to time.
Nice. So following up on the notion that you just shared about seeking feedback from people, I want to open the floor to everyone to ask questions or share a thought that was inspired by something that someone said. We have runners, but we also have mics. So if anyone has a comment or a question, if you just raise your hand. Yes, in the purple, is that purple?
I just wanted to put in a plug for the AMC mentorship program. It's only in the 3rd year, but they do an amazing job of pairing mentees and mentors, and there's a lot of great supportive women already in the group.
Thank you for sharing that. Karen?
Hi. I just want to say a lot of what we're talking about is about things we have control over. As when we're new in our careers, a lot of things we don't have control over. And a lot of times we're at the mercy, quote unquote, of our supervisors or people who have more control over our careers. And beyond interrupting, I just wanted to say it's okay to call things out and say that's not okay or this is not cool. And I've done it a couple of times in my career. It's very scary, but the reactions were amazingly positive. So I just wanted to give that as an example, that we sometimes think that our supervisors are in our heads or they know exactly what we're experiencing and might be affected by it in a major way. But if we are outspoken and brave for a few seconds, I think the solution, the outcome is much better. Thank you.
I just want to, I can't say enough about that. I think particularly when people are in the early parts, right? That power imbalance is really crucial. And I didn't tell this story. It is a story that I told on the phone, which I forgot to tell here. But it was when I was in school, and my advisor and I got in a fight, which is really bad. You should not fight with your thesis advisor, the head of your thesis. You should definitely not yell at them in a room when they're yelling at you. But as a result, what happened because of that interaction, a group of other people were in a room next door, and they heard us. And it empowered the other group. So then we as a group were able to say some things about what we wanted to do with our theses, et cetera. But it was that moment of sort of really forcefully saying, no, I'm not going to do this. We're going to do it this way. And eventually we navigated. But I can't say that enough because of the differentials in power.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, and Karen, thank you for sharing that story of bravery, and Lisa too, but I want to offer up the thought to practice maybe how you approach those situations so that you don't end up in a shouting.
I was just saying, earlier in my career, I was yelling. I don't do that anymore. But it was one of those moments where I had to learn, right, how to navigate that. And it was helpful to have a group that then what happened after the yelling was we came together as a group and developed a strategy, which was much more effective. Right. But it still was about that. It was the catalyst, and it was about those power differentials.
Right. Another good thought about when to speak up and a power move that I learned about from a woman who wrote a book, Phyllis Critic, Negotiating at an Uneven Table, was knowing when to walk away. So you were actually walking away. I think in that story you were metaphorically saying, I am not doing this assignment. I want to do this assignment. And so walking away, so I have a story to tell. So this is like a life balance story. So here's something not to do. My husband and I both had conferences in the same city, San Diego, lovely time. Our kids were like 5 and 6, 2 boys. And we decided, hey, perfect, let's both go to our conferences and take the kids. This will work out fine. So then there was the family differentiation of who's going to watch the kids. There was some nanny kind of folks that you could hire. But everybody was like, well, I have to be at this and I have to be at this. I was at the AMA meeting. He was at a continuing education conference for physicians. But I was at the American Medical Association, and I had been representing nursing to these negotiations around certain levels of payment and whether they were going to pay nurse practitioners equally and whether we were going to have a vote in this thing and blah, 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 blah. So it was a lot of heavy negotiations. And at one point, I went to a microphone to make a statement, but then it was my turn to go and relieve the husband down at the other end of the island with the kids, and I made my point and walked out. And I didn't think anything of it. I just made my point and walked out. The next day, when I showed up, they all came to me. What do you need? What do we do? They thought I walked out because I was mad. I walked out because it was my turn to go relieve my husband. We had negotiated this. And it was a very funny vacation. And in a lot of ways, it even ended up with a fish in the bathtub. But that they caught, and we ended up cooking at the restaurant. But it was a very funny vacation. But that broke. That was the fight. That broke. After that, everything opened up. Everything opened up, and I realized it was because they had perceived that I walked out. And instead of hanging in there for everything, I'm going to fight, no, I'm going to stay this, and I'm out of here to go watch the game. I didn't own up to that.
Are there other questions? I see someone in the back, yes.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment about work-life balance. I think it's part of the way that we protect our mind and our health, and I personally like to meditate, and NYU Mindful has some amazing programs, so if you haven't checked it out, I would just like to suggest that you do.
Thank you. I apologize. I should have asked everyone before you ask your question or share your comment, can you just tell us your name and maybe your school or unit just so that we can get to know each other in the room. So will you go ahead and tell us who you are?
Do you want to know my name?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Maya Jax. I'm at the Provost's office at the program called Global Research Initiatives.
Okay. And the woman who shared the AMC resource?
Hi, I'm Roseanne Limoncelli. I'm over at Tisch in the Department of Film and Television.
Thank you. Karen, can you?
Oh, sure. Karen Nersessian with the Provost's office.
Thank you. And Cheryl, you spoke earlier. Can you just?
Cheryl Antonio at Tisch.
Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to hear from the panelists
Can you
about the
first
issue of.
introduce yourself,
Oh,
please?
right, I forgot. Chris Kovner, I'm from Myers Nursing. Talk about titles and the use of titles and when you use titles and when you don't use titles and how to navigate that.
I think it's such a good question. So I use them as much as I can. It's part of, when I said that I at some point realized I just needed to be me and not be so worried about the kind of external perception of what a professor is. Really, I was referring to like who I am, how I interact with my students, how I interact with colleagues. But I made a choice to use the titles as much as possible, to wear suits more often than not, to do some of this kind of external dressing, because I know that people will always have that perception, at least for a long time, perhaps for the rest of my career, based on what I look like, that I'm not a professor, or that I'm not, I don't direct a clinic, or I don't do things that other people understand are impressive when they hear the title, but not when they see me. So I made that choice. Not everyone does, and I see colleagues who are similar in age and background to me who made a choice. If I want to walk into school wearing jeans and all of those things, I'll do that, and it's fine. But for me, I've found it to be helpful. The one exception is I've had a conversation with colleagues when I co-teach. Sometimes I have colleagues who want to be called Professor so-and-so in the classroom, and I do prefer to be called by my first name. That's one place where I've not wanted the title, but otherwise I found it to be helpful. And it's a question, is it a crutch? Is it something that, should I just be fighting for the recognition based on just who I am? But I've made a choice to at least short circuit some of the issues that I've had in the past by using titles, just to get that credential piece out there. It doesn't solve every problem, but it sometimes helps. I don't know if others have made similar choices.
I think throughout my career, thank you for the question. I think throughout my career, I've used titles differently, quite frankly. I think when I was younger, I was much more conscientious about titles and what that meant in terms of presentation, et cetera. And I mentioned earlier co-teaching, and I always co-taught with people who were at least 20 to 25 years older than I was. None of the people I co-taught with were my peers. And as I said earlier, they were almost all scientists, mathematicians, they were in the STEM fields, et cetera. And so I usually deferred to whatever they were being referred to in the classroom setting, et cetera. And I think that was because of the external perceptions. If I'm really honest, I would think I was just sort of falling in line. I think as I matured, I had to think about titling differently, because sometimes I had to create my own title, right, for my own job, like this title. And so...
Did you say unlike this?
No, sort of like this title. Like this title. And so that is a different, right, that has been a different exercise, which is to really think about who I've wanted to be in the institutions, particularly in a field that didn't exist 20 years ago. So I've had to think about titling and signaling differently. So I'll give you one example. Diversity is a word that is used a lot and has been used a lot recently. Multicultural was a word that was used in the 80s and 90s, right? And now we're at belonging and inclusion, right? And some people keep asking me, what is belonging? Why do you keep using that word? I can talk about that later. But that I have to think about in terms of titling, because it's also about what I'm trying to signal in terms of the discourse, in terms of what it means academically and intellectually, and where the field is moving. And that's not always just about my title, right, where I want to be in terms of the expertise or professionalism. So that's what I mean about, in my earlier parts of my career, I think it was much more about who I wanted to be, how I was presenting myself, et cetera. As I matured, it was to think about what the field is, and what the institution is, and what the connections are that I want to make. So I'll end this by saying, when I came into NYU and we were in discussion about Chief Diversity Officer, we knew that would be the title, but what would be the other title? What would be the other pieces? And what I know about this field is moving toward inclusion and belonging, not equity and diversity, right? So I had to start to think about, and we know that these intersections with innovation and entrepreneurship and the changing demography of the United States, and particularly what's happening with the 20 new jobs that don't even exist now that millennials and Generation Z will be in, that would be a key diversity, right, point is about innovation and entrepreneurship, right? So that should be in the title. But I wouldn't have done that 20 years ago, right? Because that's not where the field was. I wasn't in the field 20 years ago, but if I had been, I wouldn't have done that.
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris, thanks. I think in terms of titles, so I think titles are important as you gain entrance and people would need to understand who you are and what you're doing there. And so titles have a certain importance, and at different points in your career you use them for different reasons. And so 2 points. One, it's also about names. So I have a hyphenated name. And I didn't always have a hyphenated name. I didn't hyphenate it when I was married. I hyphenated it when I was applying to the PhD program and I had children, and they had a different last name, although their middle name was Sullivan and their last name was Marks. It wasn't hyphenated. So I decided to hyphenate it because I was entering a new part of my career, and I had written under Eileen Sullivan, but now this was going to be different. And so for me, it was a personal statement and had a certain ring to it, and it worked. So I was being interviewed by Senator Arlen Specter as a nominee to sit on a particular commission. And so and Arlen Specter, a senator from Pennsylvania, always preferred to interview people who he was writing a letter of recommendation for, which it sounded like he would write it. So you sit down it was actually not a desk office, but table and chairs, and he was sitting on a sofa, and the first thing he said to me was, "Why do you hyphenate your name?" So I had prepared, of course, for all of the questions that I was going to answer about why I was good for this particular job, and he said, "Why do you hyphenate your name?" And I looked at him and I said, "Well, I wanted the daycare to find me." And he said, "What?" I said, "Well, my kids were named Marks, I was named Sullivan. The daycare, one had a nosebleed one day and they couldn't find it, so I hyphenated my name, and that's why I hyphenated it. And I also, was going to write under that." And by that point, he was like, "What?" I think, he was like, "Oh my God, a feminist in the room, and am I going to get in trouble for this? Or is someone going to come to me, whatever." And he was like, "Oh, all right, whatever." So, and then titles. So when I came here with my name, I started to use a much simpler identification for me. And so I'm known as Dean Eileen. And that was given to me by the people that I worked with at Penn before I came here and said, "Oh my God, you're now Dean Eileen." And I said, "All right, I'll start using that." And that worked because it was a brand. And, people do that now in hip hop and Beyonce and whatever. I'm saying, "Okay, I'm Dean Eileen." And everyone said that was cool. And so I use that. I sign, it comes up on different things. People use it, people feel comfortable. And so no titles, no nothing, it's just Dean Eileen. Right?
Right.
Right?
Pat?
Hi, I'm Pat Carey. Tracy, what do you do to rejuvenate?
That's not fair.
Well, the moderator has to always have almost the last word.
Sure, no. So I actually, it's something that I struggle with as well, but over the course of time, I've discovered that I like to learn new things. And so I become obsessive about different activities. So I guess about 15 years ago now at this point, I started taking karate, and I took it for many years and earned a black belt in karate. And watch out. I started, at one point, I fell into and fell in love with Bikram yoga. And I, took Bikram yoga obsessively and became really good at it. And most recently, about 2 years ago, I started playing tennis. So I take tennis lessons. And so there's something very refreshing about immersing myself completely in something new, starting from scratch and absolutely sucking at it. And then over time, like developing proficiency. And so that's kind of how I rejuvenate. So Pat said almost to last question, so we have time for one more question, and I think I see a hand back there. Yes.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Leslie Smithy, Senior Director of Quality Assurance and Patient Care at the College of Dentistry. First, shout out to the tennis players, and one of my fellow tennis players, Francis, is across the room.
Oh, look
Good
at
to see you.
that. We
Play
can
tennis.
form a
It's
club.
a great lifelong sport. Well, I have a couple of questions or comments. Number one, tennis is great, so you can play all year, indoors and outdoors. So it is a wonderful way to rejuvenate, and you can hit that ball, and you don't need a therapist. You just need to focus on the ball. But I have a question for Lisa Coleman. Oh, my other comment is about titles. I think as women, I am from a different generation perhaps than many of you. I believe that titles matter. Use it as a badge of honor and a weapon of ass destruction if you need to. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, but I'll give you an example. So in the College of Dentistry, in the dean's office, we call each other by our first names. And I will never forget, I've been here now 4 years, but I've been in healthcare for 30-something. Long story short, we have many women of color who are support staff, lovely, lovely people. And I have been with the deans, most of whom are white males, white hair, and I've been introduced as Leslie, as everybody else is referred to as Dean. I find it highly offensive. So I have always quietly managed to pull people aside and say, make no mistake, I earned my doctorate, I earned my master's, and I do not do anything but earn your respect the same way you immediately give it to my male colleagues. So that's my comment about that. Now, Ms. Coleman, I welcome you to NYU, and I'm happy to take the survey, and I'm seriously thinking of blocking out a certain amount of time because I really do want to take it seriously. What I'm wondering is, what do you hope to accomplish from that survey?
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, let me just say a little bit about the survey to begin with. So the survey, the assessment came about through a series of events, and one was the town hall in 2015, and then a task force was formed, and then a working group was formed out of that task force. And the assessment is one of the things that we're doing. There's a bias response line, and of course, hiring me was one of the other things that came out of this. So the assessment is one tool to collect information about equity, diversity, inclusion, and to some degree belonging across the institution. And the idea is for everyone to participate, because what we got at the 2015 listening sessions were a smaller sample size, if you will. And so the idea is to go out and figure out what is happening at NYU. How do individuals feel about our community? What does the collective feel? How do different schools, where are we? And where are we on these issues? And then what happens with this information is I will be collecting that information, and then I'm doing other things. I wasn't just hired to obviously do the assessment. And so we'll be collecting information in other ways through other boards, working with other colleagues across the schools, so that by the spring, we're able to come up with some priorities and some strategies to think about, okay, what are those gap areas? What have been identified as the gap areas? How do we strategically align with the missions of our schools, the mission of the university, and the missions within the schools, so that we can actually close these gap areas? So I'll give you one little, I've done these assessments before, right? I'm not new to this game. So at a former institution where I was, and this is something that's common at institutions, what you will have with, let's say, certain constituency groups, and we could say, I'll just use women as an example. And let's say you have women at the level of assistant professor, and you're not seeing movement to associate or to full, right? So what you're seeing is a revolving door, is what we call it, right? People are coming in, they're becoming assistant professors, but they're not getting promoted, and they're moving out. So the number remains stagnant. Does that make sense? So you started at 15%, you maybe went to 16%, but pretty much it's remained the same consistently. Well, what we know is there's a problem there, right? Because something should be changing over time, right? You should be dipping, you should be moving, something should be happening here. But if it's just the same, then you know things are sort of what we call is that revolving door. People are coming in and out, and they're not getting, if we're not seeing the levels of promotion. So this is something that could be identified on the assessment, right? Because people will be talking about their experiences as assistant professors, we hope. And so one of the things that we could learn from the assessment is, if we notice that gap area, what's happening with assistant professors, right? And I don't know what's happened with assistant professors at Harvard or at Tufts or at CUNY may be very different than what's happening with assistant professors at NYU. Does that make sense? So that's the idea, is to identify these areas, to figure out then how we prioritize, and I'll work with the deans and others across the schools to figure out then how do we figure out what those priorities are. And the priorities won't be the same for every unit in every area. So the other thing I will say is that people ask me a lot about, and I'll end with this comment so we can actually have, I know I'm the alcohol is out there, is that people will ask me often, am I going to come up with a diversity and inclusion and belonging and equity strategic plan for NYU? No. No. Why? Because NYU is a complex institution with multiple schools and multiple areas and units. The way in which diversity and inclusion and equity works in the medical field in terms of racial and ethnic disparities, gender disparities, transgender communities, disability, et cetera, is completely different in some ways than the way it's going to work in the arts and how I'm going to work with Tish, right? That's very different. And the outreach in terms of communities and performance and who attends performances, right? Performances don't happen in the operating room. I mean, they do, but not in the same way, right? So we have to be much more nimble. And I'll say this because when we approach diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, we have to approach it in the same way we approach science, we approach the humanities. It's a field, and we have to think about the expansive nature of that field and the tentacles and the areas, and then how we prioritize in terms of closing those gaps. And I'm more than happy to talk a lot about the assessment and the work that will be going forward. And I look forward to your partnership, because this is not a one-woman show.
Yeah. So I couldn't be more delighted if that had been planned to end with a plug for the assessment. And I will ask those of you who are either on the working group or who are ambassadors, can you just stand for a minute so that people can see you? And if you have additional questions about the assessment, please feel free to ask any of us during the reception. We really want to hear from everyone. So on that note, I want to...
Will you just say it's private again?
Oh, yes. We want to underscore the fact that even though you need to log in with your NetID and password so that we can verify that only eligible members of our community are taking it and that each person is taking it only once, the working group has developed and worked with a consultant to develop a very, very tight privacy design such that NYU will never know who took the assessment. NYU will never be able to match your responses to who you are. So we have information about that privacy design on the working group's website. And any of us that stood up, we're also happy to share more information. But please rest assured that not only is there no will for the university to match identities to responses, there's actually no way. It's completely anonymous. So on that note, please join me in thanking our panelists.
And thank you. And our volunteers.
Thank our volunteers for the event.
And the planning committee.
And we hope that each of you will be able to leave today with a specific skill or tool or something that you can do to continue to build resilience and hope in your career, and that you're also able to make at least one connection, a meaningful connection, with someone else in the room. We talked a lot about the support networks that we've been able to build over the course of our careers, and it starts with each of us in the room. So thank you all for being here and being engaged participants. So
Thank you, Tracy.
thanks.
Thank you.